Hi there, this is Miss Paulson. Today I am going to be doing my second lesson about classical music throughout history. So we're going to start with a quick review of last lesson, which is last lesson we kind of talked about these three things you see here. When I say classical music, people tend to use that word to describe this huge period of time from 1,000 years ago all the way to right now. And in between, we can kind of chunk them into something we would call periods. First, we talked about the medieval and the Renaissance periods. That's a big chunk of time, and from the art, you can kind of see what times we're looking at. Moving on to the Baroque period, we talked about this style that's a little bit more structured than what came before, but also had some really wild sounds. And then we finished, and we're actually going to start back up with the classical period. Again, we call all of this time a classical musical style, but there's also a chunk of time that's called the classical period. And today we're really actually going to talk about this going into this called the Romantic period. Romantic, I'll kind of define it for you as it doesn't have to do with romance or love, but more about being expressive and over the top and having a lot of emotion. So when you hear romantic, don't think of like love, think of like, oh, passion and emotion and really feeling things. And then we won't talk about this today, but eventually we'll get to modern and postmodern music too. So reviewing classical music. Classical music, it looks just like the art you see here. It's predictable, it's structured, it's organized and refined. Unlike this picture, if you look down here, where you see a person's face, but it's obviously, it's not a realistic painting. It's very, very different. Or even this painting here, where you see things are kind of, it's not realistic because it's not supposed to be. Whereas in this picture, you can see it's meant to be very refined and realistic. Classical music's very structured, it's organized, it's refined. And we're going to start today by showing the form to this piece. It's by, Joseph Haydn. He was a famous classical composer. It's a very short segment. All you're going to do is show the form with your hand, and I will do it with you. A. B. A. B. A. So you can hear from that music, it's that very refined, very elegant type of music. In the background, you see a picture of Joseph Haydn, and you can really see like he's wearing one of those powdered wigs. And that, to me, those powdered wigs really let you know what kind of music they were playing. It's very, very fancy and elegant. This classical period overlaps with the Romantic period. If you look, this one ends in about 1820-ish, and Romantic begins in the 1800s. And that's because it's not like everybody agreed one day, let's stop doing this music and then we'll do this music. No, it kind of just flows and it evolves into something different. You can see from the art how things were different. In this picture, it's, of a person. It's very refined and fancy looking. And then here you see Van Gogh's Starry Night, and you can see things are almost more dreamlike, and it's very expressive. And it's not of a person, it's of nature, which is a big part of the Romantic era as they kind of return to nature and how nature influences art and music. Today, I want to talk to you for the rest of this lesson about someone who really was important to both of those styles, Beethoven. Now, Beethoven, he started out as a classical composer, but he helped transition music into the Romantic period. So if we go back, he's like this arrow. He is the person who takes us from this to this. And there were other people doing it too, but he's kind of the biggest example we have. Beethoven had 3 periods of composing. His first period, his early period, he composes in a very classical style, and he's very influenced by Mozart and his teacher Haydn. So the man we heard his music earlier and we showed the hand signs was Beethoven's teacher. I'm just going to play a little bit of his music, and this is early Beethoven. So you're going to hear it sounds very classical and refined. So you can hear just from that short example, it sounds like what we've already heard so far. It doesn't sound very emotionful is not a word, but it doesn't have a lot of emotion to it. Whereas as he grows up and he gets to be a more, he composes more and more and more, he starts to get into what is called his heroic period. And this is kind of in the middle of his life here. His music becomes really bold. It becomes heroic. And he writes pieces now, instead of just for small groups, he starts to write for these huge orchestras. He also begins to lose his hearing. Something you might have heard about Beethoven is by the end of his life, he was deaf, which was true. And actually, for most of his life, he was deaf. He did a lot of his life without being able to hear, and yet wrote a lot of great music. I am going to show you a piece of work, and I'll have to fast forward to my favorite part. At the beginning, you're going to hear that Beethoven, this is a piece you've heard before. Guessing you've heard that before, and so I'm actually going to go to my favorite part. I apologize, I might have to click around to find it. Let me see, I think it's up here more. Yeah, here we go. So in this section, it's going to go from one piece to the next, and I want you to listen for the crescendo. This is why Beethoven's actually maybe my favorite composer. He could make music that was so big and exciting. And even though he came from this traditional background, he started to come out with this music that was so full of emotion and full of excitement. Here we go. So he builds the excitement. And that's a good pausing point. I want you to just notice how, compared to the music we heard earlier, this is so much more emotional, so much more exciting to listen to. Now, there we go. Next, we want to talk about Beethoven's late period. In this period, his music is solidly romantic. And again, I don't mean that, he's in love or something like that, but meaning that the sound is from the romantic period, that it's emotional, it's expressive, and sometimes it's unpredictable. Like people listening back then would hear it and be like, what? This is crazy music. Even though for our ears now, it probably doesn't feel that way, but back then it absolutely did. Beethoven also during this time, he becomes effectively deaf. By 18, I believe, 14, he's deaf. He can still hear a teeny bit. He can hear if you play like a really high sound and then a really low sound. He could tell you, oh, that's a high sound, that's a low sound. But he can't hear. And so when he composes all these amazing works, he can't really hear the orchestra play them, but he can still hear it in his head just from his years of experience. He also, during this time, unfortunately, he becomes much more withdrawn and socially difficult. He had always been a bit of a loner and a bit of an oddball, as it was, but especially because he was deaf, and especially back then when there was so little to help people who are differently abled, he really, really struggled. And he would go to dinners and be really messy looking and have like dirty clothes. And he just didn't take care of himself as well as he could have back then. He also had a pretty difficult life. He had a father who was very cruel to him, and he had a lot of family drama. So the thing about Beethoven is probably if we had met him, he would not be fun to talk to. But gosh, he really, really was good at composing music. For our last little bit, I will just play a little bit of his Ninth Symphony. This is one of his older pieces of work of his late period, and people at the time either thought it was the craziest thing they'd ever heard or the best thing they'd ever heard. And I'll have to skip because they have a lot of talking. Now, we won't get to this part, but if you look in the background, there's groups of people. And since they don't have instruments, you're probably guessing that they are singers, which they are. Something Beethoven did is he would make these huge orchestras that were bigger than ever, and then even add a choir on top of it. And we will pause there. I believe there's only one last thing for us to cover today, which is, oh, I didn't put it in. That's okay. I did put it in, but my computer had a fit. Let Miss Paulson fix it. There we go. So to reiterate, today we really mostly talked about Beethoven, and Beethoven kind of lives in the space between the classical period and romantic period. Next lesson, I will be talking about the romantic period, and I will really probably stay there for a while because you have to know during these 80 or so years, there's a ton of like the best music. This is the music that even Miss Paulson at home will listen to on her own time. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you for listening.